the world of Wicca, oaths are sacred. A bond forged in blood is more than a promise. It's a contract with the universe itself. Breaking it has consequences. Sherry Harlan believed in the power of ritual. She embraced the mysteries of the craft, finding solace in its ancient traditions. But she never could have imagined that her devotion would lead to betrayal and death. January 2nd, 2010, a quiet apartment in Everett, Washington. A woman vanishes. Days later, a burned-out car. Inside, something unthinkable. What happened that night? A lover's quarrel? Or something far darker? To understand, we have to go back to the beginning. Sherry Harlan lived by these beliefs. A 35-year-old woman with an open heart and a fascination for the mystical, she found a sense of purpose in the ancient practices of Wicca. It was more than faith, it was a way of life. And when she met Eric Christensen, she believed she had found someone who shared that devotion. Their love was intense, rooted in rituals and sealed with blood, a sacred pact, unbreakable. Or so she thought. But love, when twisted by jealousy, can turn into something else entirely. January 2010, Everett, Washington. A city tucked away in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by thick forests and endless gray skies. The kind of place where secrets can stay buried. For days, Sherry's friends hadn't heard from her. She wasn't answering calls. She hadn't shown up to work. Something felt wrong. The moment police opened her door, they immediately knew this was a crime scene. At first, no one knew what to make of it. Was this a burglary? Was the bleach used to wash away dirt? But the deeper police dug, the more twisted the story became. Then, her car was found. Charred, blackened metal, melted glass, a husk of what was once her vehicle. It sat abandoned, lifeless. Inside, investigators discovered a skull, burned, unrecognizable. Because this wasn't just about a missing woman, or even just about murder. This was about obsession, betrayal, and a blood oath that one man was willing to kill for. The case would take a turn no one saw coming, because in the end, the only thing more powerful than love is fear. Before she was a headline, before she became a cautionary tale of love turned deadly, Sherry Harlan was a woman searching for meaning. Born in 1974, she was always drawn to the spiritual and the mysterious. She wasn't the type to follow the crowd. She carved her own path, finding solace in Wicca, a practice that emphasized nature, energy, and karmic balance. To Sherry, the universe was alive, listening, and guiding her toward something bigger than herself. By the time she was in her mid-30s, she had built a quiet life in Everett, Washington. She worked hard, surrounded herself with close friends, and continued deepening her spiritual beliefs. But what she wanted more than anything was connection, someone who understood her on a soul level. And for a while, she thought she had found that in Eric Christensen. Eric was charismatic, passionate. He shared her love for Wicca, but where Sherry saw beauty in it, Eric saw power. Their connection was intense, built on shared rituals and whispered promises. It wasn't just love, it was a bond, one that, in Eric's eyes, was unbreakable. But love that burns too hot can consume everything in its path. They had moved in together and things were going smoothly. In November 2009, Eric Christensen was arrested for violating a domestic violence order involving a previous relationship. He was sentenced to serve 1 month in jail. And while he was locked away, life outside went on. Sherry had known Dan Young for years. He was different from Eric. Kind, stable, safe. In Eric's absence, their friendship deepened. Conversations became longer. Late-night texts turned into something more. Dan made a down payment on a home for her, which she moved to. He even bought her a laptop, a small but meaningful gesture. A connection was forming, one that Eric couldn't control. Even when Eric was released from jail a month later, Sherry and Dan didn't stop talking. In fact, their relationship only grew stronger. She was caught between two worlds. The intensity of Eric's love, which often felt suffocating, and the comfort of Dan's presence, which felt freeing. When Eric found out about Dan Young, his jealousy boiled over. In his eyes, Sherry hadn't just strayed, she had broken a sacred oath. And that's when he proposed something extreme. A blood oath. To Eric, this wasn't just a dramatic gesture. It was a binding spell, a ritual that would tie them together forever. It wasn't about love anymore, it was about control. And Sherry agreed to it. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of guilt, maybe just to keep the peace. But here's the thing about oaths. They only work if both people believe in them. Because even after sealing their bond in blood, Sherry continued seeing Dan. And then came the morning of January 2, 2010. Eric had spent the night at Sherry's apartment. Maybe he thought things were finally back to normal. Maybe he believed the blood oath had erased her doubts, had bound her to him completely. But then he saw it. Sherry sitting on the bed, texting. And not just anyone, Dan Young. Something inside Eric snapped. All the jealousy, the rage, the feeling of betrayal, it exploded. A fight broke out. Shouting, accusations. Maybe Sherry tried to calm him down. Maybe she tried to explain. But for Eric, there was nothing to explain. In his mind, she had broken something sacred. And in the next few hours, she would pay the ultimate price. If you're captivated by true crime stories and want to stay updated on the darkest cases, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We release in-depth crime documentaries just like this one, uncovering the chilling details behind real-life mysteries. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button now. To understand the crime, we have to understand the man behind it. Eric Christensen wasn't just jealous. He wasn't just controlling. He was dangerous. His past told a story long before January 2010, a story of a man who always wanted power, not just over the people in his life, but over something bigger. Eric wasn't content with following. He wanted to lead, and not just in relationships, in faith. Eric's fascination with the occult ran deep. He had been practicing Wicca for years, but to him, it was more than just nature worship and rituals. It was a means to control, a way to wield influence. And being a mere follower, that wasn't enough. He had plans, big ones. Eric spoke to friends about starting his own church, a place where he, not anyone else, would set the rules. A place where he was the leader, where people followed him. It wasn't about spirituality. It wasn't even about Wicca. It was about domination. But power? Real power? Wasn't something Eric had. At least, not in the way he wanted. Because legally, Eric was a marked man. Long before he met Sherry, Eric had already left a trail of destruction in his wake. He was a registered sex offender. His crime? Rape in the 3rd degree. In Washington state, that means non-consensual sex with someone who was unable to resist. It wasn't just a mistake. It was predatory, and it left a permanent stain on his record. Eric had spent time behind bars. He had been in and out of trouble. He had violated domestic violence orders from past relationships, and yet, he still managed to find people who trusted him, who believed his words. Because Eric was good at one thing: manipulation. When Eric met Sherry, she wasn't just another girlfriend. She was a believer, someone who shared his fascination with Wicca, someone who he could shape. But the thing about shaping someone is, they don't always stay the way you want them to. When Eric realized that Sherry was slipping away, turning to Dan Young, choosing another man over him, he didn't just feel hurt, he felt betrayed. Because in Eric's mind, he was more than just a man. He was a force, a leader, someone who deserved loyalty, worship, control. And when he saw that slipping through his fingers, he made a decision. If he couldn't have Sherry completely, no one would. January 4, 2010, it had been 2 days since anyone had seen Sherry Harlan. She hadn't shown up for work. She wasn't returning calls. To those who knew her, this was more than just unusual. It was alarming. One of her coworkers, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, made the call. Sherry Harlan was officially reported missing. When officers arrived at her apartment, they expected the usual. A woman who had gone off the grid for a few days, maybe a misunderstanding. But what they found inside changed everything. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. And as they went in, the bleach smell was overwhelming. The smell hit them immediately. The strong chemical odor still clung to the air. Someone had tried to clean, to erase. And it wasn't just the smell. There were visible streaks of bleach on the floor, like someone had scrubbed in a hurry, but not carefully enough. And then something more disturbing. Signs of a struggle, Furniture slightly shifted as if it had been bumped or knocked over. A few scattered objects on the ground. It wasn't immediately obvious, but to trained eyes it was there. Police discovered knife marks in the bedroom mattress. A bloody footprint was also found on a t-shirt inside the apartment. Both Harlan and her dog were missing from the apartment. This wasn't just the home of a woman who had walked away from her life. Something had happened here. And with that, Sherry Harlan's apartment was no longer just the last place she had been seen. It was a crime scene. A neighbor reported hearing yelling about a week before Harlan was reported missing and seeing a man outside next to Harlan's car with the dog inside of the car. As investigators dug into Sherry's life, a pattern emerged. Her recent fear, her troubled relationship, and one name repeated over and over again: Eric Christensen. Friends told police about the blood oath, about Eric's jealousy, about the violent side he tried to keep hidden. Then they learned about Dan Young, a man Sherry had grown close to, the man Eric despised, the reason he had forced Sherry into a ritual binding her to him. And just hours before she disappeared, Sherry had been texting Young. Where was Eric? Detectives needed to speak with him. But when they went looking for Eric Christensen, they didn't find him at home. They found him at a medical center. He was sitting in an examination room waiting to be treated for a hand injury. When questioned, Eric had a story ready: a robbery. He claimed he had been attacked by 3 men who tried to rob him. A struggle had broken out and he had been injured in the fight. To the officers listening, something felt off. Eric was calm, too calm. His first statement: he hadn't seen Sherry in days. That was lie number 1. When police pressed him, he admitted that wasn't true. He had been at her apartment. He had spent the night there. But according to him, when he left that morning, she was alive. Then came the next lie. Eric insisted there had been no fight, nothing unusual, no tension. But police already had evidence suggesting otherwise. They had seen the apartment, the bleach, the struggle, so they pushed him further. His third statement? He admitted that, yes, they had fought. "Yeah, I was mad," he said on a police recording. "I was really mad at her because of her sugar daddy. If we were in the ancient times, you could get stoned, beaten, bludgeoned, cast out," he said on a police recording, "and in some cases, from what I understand, death. That means she is no good. Her blood is garbage," Christensen told police during an interview. The ancient text, ways, she'd become a warlock. It's a Scottish word. It means oathbreaker, traitor, enemy. His fourth statement? She had mentioned leaving town. Maybe that's what had happened. 4 different versions, 4 contradictions, and 1 glaring truth. Eric was lying. At this point, police couldn't prove what happened to Sherry, but one thing was clear. Eric Christensen was the last person to see her alive, and if they wanted to find out the truth, they weren't going to let him out of their sight. Eric Christensen had lied, over and over again. He had changed his story. He had made up an attack by 3 men. He had tried to explain away his injuries, but police weren't buying it. They had evidence of a struggle in Sherry's apartment, the smell of bleach, the signs of a cover-up. Now they needed something to tie Eric directly to the crime, and they were about to get exactly that. As suspicion around Eric grew, detectives moved fast. They obtained a search warrant for his apartment. If Eric had done anything to Sherry, there was a chance he had left behind something he hadn't been able to scrub away, and inside, they found it. In his home, officers discovered a pair of jeans with blood stains. Then, a bloody sock. But it wasn't just bloody, it had been partially burned, as if someone had tried to destroy the evidence, but didn't finish the job. And then, the most damning piece of all, a single shoe. At first glance, it seemed like nothing, but investigators recognized the tread, a unique pattern on the sole. It matched the bloody footprint on the t-shirt left behind at Sherry's apartment. This was it. On January 8, 2010, just 6 days after Sherry was last seen alive, Eric Christensen was arrested. He didn't resist, didn't fight. Maybe in that moment he knew it was over. But what police didn't know yet, what they were about to uncover, was that Eric hadn't just killed Sherry. He had gone to extreme lengths to try and erase her. And when the next piece of evidence surfaced, it would be unlike anything they had ever seen. Eric Christensen was behind bars. Police had found blood on his clothes, a shoe that matched a bloody footprint in Sherry Harlan's apartment, a sock partially burned, stained with evidence. But there was still one crucial thing missing: Sherry's body. And then a tip came in. The caller's identity was never made public. All they said was that there was a vehicle, abandoned, burned, sitting in a remote area of Snohomish County. It was enough to send police racing to the scene. What they found confirmed their worst fears: a charred, blackened shell of a car, its windows shattered, the inside nothing but melted plastic and scorched metal. And inside, something horrifying: a human skull. Forensic teams rushed to process the remains, but deep down, everyone already knew. It was Sherry Harlan. The question now wasn't if Eric had killed her. It was how far he had gone to erase her. The discovery of the car was a turning point. It confirmed that this was no disappearance, no random act of violence. This was calculated, deliberate, cold. And yet, the full story had not been told. Because just days later, on January 11, 2010, someone else came forward, and when police heard what he had to say, the case took an even darker turn. Eric Christensen thought he had gotten away with it. He had lied, he had burned, and he might have believed that without a body, police couldn't prove what he had done. But just days after his arrest, who came forward? Someone who had been there. Someone who had helped him. A witness to the blood oath. His name was Ryan. He wasn't just any friend of Eric's. He was someone who had witnessed the blood oath. He had seen Sherry pledge herself to Eric in ritual. He had watched them seal their bond in blood, and now, just weeks later, Sherry was gone. Ryan couldn't stay silent anymore, so he told police everything. Ryan told investigators that on January 3, 2010, the day after Sherry was last seen alive, Eric called him. He needed help. Ryan agreed to meet up, thinking it was just another favor for a friend. But when he got there, Eric was waiting for him, and so was Sherry's car. Ryan got inside. He barely had time to process what was happening when Eric turned to him and said something that made his blood run cold. Sherry's body is in the trunk. It was too late to back out. And so, for the next 2 days, Ryan became an accomplice to something unimaginable: destroying the evidence. Over the course of 48 hours, Ryan drove Eric around Snohomish County, and as they traveled, Eric got rid of the evidence. Bag after bag, some he threw out the window, others he buried. He wasn't just trying to hide a crime, he was trying to erase a person. Ryan led police to several locations. Some body parts were recovered, others never found. Detectives could only confirm what they already feared. Sherry Harlan's final moments had been brutal. Multiple stab wounds to her torso, a knife wound to her head, and the most horrifying detail: her body had been cut apart. But even in death, Sherry wasn't the only victim, because there was still one more thing missing: her dog. It was never found. No one knows what Eric did to it. Maybe that's for the best. With Ryan's confession, detectives had everything they needed. The only thing left was justice. The case against Eric Christensen was airtight. The crime scene, the blood-stained clothes, the burned-out car, and now a witness who had helped him dispose of the body. There was no more running. There were no more lies to tell. In May 2010, Christensen went on trial for Harlan's murder. His friend Ryan got immunity for testifying at trial. Prosecutors weren't just going after him for killing Sherry Harlan. They were making it clear this was premeditated, calculated, a crime committed with intent. If convicted, he was looking at a maximum of life in prison. And as the trial began, the courtroom would hear every horrifying detail. The prosecution wasted no time painting a picture of obsession and control. They argued that Eric saw Sherry as property, not a person. When she strayed, when she continued seeing Dan Young despite their blood oath, he snapped. And what he did next was planned, masked as ritual. They presented the blood-stained jeans, the burned sock, the matching footprint. They showed how he had tried to destroy Sherry's body, scattering her across the county like she was nothing. And then they played Ryan's confession. The jury listened in silence. His defense? He never denied killing Sherry, but he refused to admit it was premeditated. His attorneys claimed it was a crime of passion, a fight gone wrong, that he didn't plan to kill her, he just lost control. They pushed for a lesser charge, manslaughter instead of murder, but the evidence was overwhelming. The messages, the bleach, the burned car, the dismemberment. This wasn't a moment of rage, it was a systematic cover-up, and the jury saw right through it. On June 14, 2010, after weeks of testimony, the jury returned with their decision. Guilty, first-degree murder, 37.5 years in prison. Eric Christensen showed no remorse, not in his statements, not in his expressions. To this day, he maintains that Sherry's death was not murder, but the evidence tells a different story. The case shook Everett, Washington. True crime shows like Snapped covered the chilling details. Online forums picked apart the blood oath, the Wiccan ties, the sheer brutality of the crime. And for those who knew Sherry, they were left with one question. Did she ever see it coming? Because in the end, Eric didn't just break a promise, he turned a sacred bond into a death sentence. And for Sherry Harlan, there was no way out. Sherry Harlan was a woman who believed in the power of the unseen. She believed in energy, in connection, in devotion, and in the end, it was devotion that cost her everything. Her story is one of control, manipulation, and obsession, a cautionary tale of how love, when twisted by the wrong hands, can become deadly. Did justice truly prevail? Eric Christensen sits in prison today, serving 37.5 years for Sherry's murder. But does that erase what he did? Does it bring her back? Does it account for the parts of her that were never found? Or the life that was stolen too soon? Justice, in the legal sense, was served. But in the real world, Sherry Harlan's story remains a tragedy that cannot be undone. This case isn't just about one man's obsession. It's about patterns of control and violence that exist in relationships every day. If someone isolates you, controls you, makes you feel like you owe them your loyalty, that isn't love. That is danger. If you or someone you know is in a controlling or abusive relationship, there is help. Organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline offer support at all times. You don't have to stay. You don't have to be trapped. There is always a way out. Sherry Harlan placed her trust in a man who saw her not as an equal but as a possession. She believed in sacred oaths, but some promises should never be made. And if you're fascinated by true crime, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss an upload. We have more gripping stories coming soon, shedding light on cases that deserve to be told. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.